So we're going to continue our discussion of the changing workplace by beginning with women at work. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier in this module, there is projected to be more women in the workplace all the way up until 2050. So right now, it's estimated that women make up about 40% of the overall workforce. Participation rates for women are, ironically, highest in the least developed countries, developing countries, where basically poverty pushes women into all sorts of occupations, and also in some of the most developed countries like Northern Europe. I'm talking about Scandinavia, where the socialist system basically does not make the same differences between men and women workers. And of course, one of the countries that had the highest rates of women participation throughout history was, of course, the Soviet Union, where all women were encouraged to work. The participation of women at work seems to be a little bit lower in nations in the Middle East. And one of the unfortunate trends, of course with the exception of places like the Soviet Union or also in Scandinavia, is that frequently wherever women work, they tend to be in lower productivity jobs, which include agriculture and low-level services. They tend to be paid less, and sometimes they're paid less even if they hold the exact same kinds of jobs as men. Now we kind of start wondering why that might be. Now a lot of the new attitudes from feminism would assert that women were entitled to the same jobs, rights, and ambitions as men. Of course, this is kind of a new thing in the United States, but as I mentioned, is relatively commonplace in Northern Europe and also the Soviet Union. A lot of men also believe in certain kind of traditional images of gender stereotypes. Things like women are too emotional to manage well, they don't have ambition, they don't understand logic, they're not tough, and furthermore that they're unable to balance their career and their family because of the obligations of having children and things like that. Now, we know that this isn't necessarily true, but unfortunately stereotypes are kind of ingrained. Part of it, of course, is it's embedded in culture. I mean, even though we talk about it's not a good thing, we see these things all the time in music and popular media, television, that these images that seem to reinforce stereotypes about women in the workplace. Furthermore, in certain blue-collar settings, sexism may be very blatant. And to the extent that people are openly expressing their biases against women. And furthermore, in managerial settings, there's still this discrimination, but it's usually subtle, and sometimes it's even unintentional. And of course, as I mentioned, some of it, in addition to being reinforced through television and popular media, can also be stemming from the fact that men and women learn different ways of speaking, even in childhood. And unfortunately, this translates into the workplace, which does put women at a disadvantage. Now, kind of a corollary or a related concept to the role of women in the workplace is sexual harassment. Most women will face sexual harassment at some point in their career. And the biggest thing that I want you to take away from this concept of sexual harassment, it really has very little to do with sex at all. It's really more of a way to generate power, feelings of power and ways of putting down women. So it has very little to do with like an erotic type of thing, but it's really more of a power struggle. And the EEOC gives two guidelines that explicitly state that sexual harassment is illegal. First of all is quid pro quo. I mentioned this a little bit before during our discussion of corruption. Quid pro quo means something for something. So in a sexual harassment context, it would be if I told someone that they could have a promotion if they go on a date with me. That'd be quid pro quo, because it's a very specific exchange. A date for a promotion, or any other sort of sexual favors in exchange for a professional privilege. So that's an illegal practice. And then the second is hostile environments. A hostile environment would mean, of course, it could be something that is more like an espoused value. It could be things like just comments in the workplace, like, women are no good, or hey, you look great, or well, maybe not hey, you look great, but comments towards women of a sexual nature. There was, unfortunately, one place I worked at, there was a supervisor, and this was just like something out of a movie, except the fact it was real and it was horrible. He was known to call women by their body parts. He would call them hey legs and all sorts of bad stuff like this. This is an example of hostile work environment. It can also be reified through objects, like, for example, putting pictures of women in bikinis in your office would also be an example of the creation of a hostile work environment. Another thing that stems from women in the workplace is, for some reason, and it's hard to explain exactly why, women sometimes seem to be more likely to work in some jobs than others. And even when women do have the same jobs, they tend to have a lower status and compensation than men in the exact same kind of occupation. One of the things that is noted is that a lot of women tend to go into occupations that are administrative or in education, where you don't have a lot of women working in a lot of the traditional blue-collar professions. It's hard to say exactly why that is. Furthermore, stemming on the idea of male-female compensation, occupational segregation, as I mentioned, women taking some jobs over others, does tend to place a lot of women in female-dominated occupations where they may be lower paid than male-dominated occupations. And women also pay a very heavy earnings penalty for their childbearing years. I mean, you think about it, if a woman were to take a couple of years off to raise a child, that can be a significant detriment to their career, because that's years not only that they're out of the workplace, but that's years that they could have had work towards a promotion or a different job or occupation. And so this gap in pay between men and women is an example of sexual discrimination. Again, there's so much to talk about in women in the workplace. I've just given a very basic overview, but at least gives you some idea of some of the problems. In our next video, we will talk about diversity management and some key pieces of guidance for managing a diversity program. Looking forward to seeing you then.